I want to talk a little bit about you and the route that eventually took you to Sir Roger and to his brand of conservatism. So you had, I think, a not particularly unusual British Bengali childhood. Your dad was a restaurateur in East London. You went to university, and then you got mixed up with some bad people. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about the journey that led you into some fairly radical company when you were young.
Lord Hannon, Daniel, thank you for making time, and thank you for everything you've done to make this country, this civilization, what it is today. And I think I speak on behalf of millions of people who appreciate you being a pioneer. But I'll come back to me. I think there's something about Muslim manners that are easy, not easy to shrug off. They're always there. You know, you've got to be
very polite. But yes. Talk about yourself for once.
Coming back to Western individualism and where we are today. As you say, I grew up in a Sufi Muslim household, and by Sufi I mean not a sectarian breakaway, but most Muslims across the world, whether they're from Egypt or from India or Indonesia or indeed Nigeria, I cite those because they're the largest Muslim majority countries, have that Sufi, pietistic, mystical, contemplative, love-oriented relationship with God. And they're not like the Shia or the Sufi, they transcend that divide, and you find them in both. So it was that love-based, God-oriented home that I came from. And part of the problem, I think, at home was that we didn't talk about politics. Politics was always something that was left to politicians. So in my local mosque in Brick Lane, Peter Shaw, the MP, it was an early Brexiteer in many ways, would be campaigning on Fridays, and all that was fine. But then Bosnia happened when I was around 18, 19, where white, blonde, blue-eyed Muslims were being killed in their thousands. At the same time, John Major government and then subsequently other governments allowed in Hizb ut-Tahrir and other organizations from the Middle East and their leaderships, Saad al-Faqih from Saudi Arabia, Mohammed al-Mas'ali from Saudi Arabia, and others. And I think those of us who grew up in the late 90s and early noughties would remember the guy with the hook in Finsbury Park preaching. And their preaching, Daniel, was very strong in that, unlike calls for United Nations interventions, they said we need a Muslim army to remove and kill the Serbs, and we need a caliphate in order to destroy the West and Israel. Now, someone who was 18, 19 found that a very compelling, mobilizing call in the way that the international community, whatever that means now or then, was always talking about, let's discuss this, let's talk about that. Yep. So they were action-oriented, and that was compelling.
So for you, it happened to be the Bosnian atrocities, but you could argue that that was a kind of accident of timing, that there's always some foreign quarrel. It could be Chechnya, it could be Afghanistan, it could be Palestine, Israel, it could be one of the Iraq wars. But something was appealing, if I've understood you, about this strong brand, this strength of identity that didn't have the same sort of self-doubt or gaps that just being a sort of patriotic Brit would have had. Is that fair?
Yes, I think the key word you used is strong, and the second key word is identity. They offered a strong global sense of belonging, and that's really important for not just me, I think, but millions of young people across the West. And it doesn't have to be Muslim or Sikh or Hindu or Jewish, but it's the sense of belonging that they were able to say that you are only Muslim and you belong only to this global community, and everything else is a problem. And that comes out of Egyptian states put of thought that remove nation states, remove other loyalties, local or otherwise.
And did you feel, because I wonder whether some of this is simply that nature abhors a vacuum, is a very assertive form of political Islam an antidote to people who don't feel that they have that equally strong identity just from their nation?
Yes. I remember that being at primary school, my teachers would constantly condemn Margaret Thatcher. And there was something odd about that, because at home, my parents were grateful to the Thatcher government for being able to own their property, rather than pay rent constantly and be council tenants. Now they owned multiple properties, because after one, they were able to get on and buy other properties. So they got on the property ladder through Margaret Thatcher at home, and my parents were both Labour voters, but they loved that property-owning democracy concept. But at school, my teachers would be attacking Margaret Thatcher and the British government. So there was already kind of a cognitive dissonance between home and school. And I think that was only amplified at university, where you see student unions and others focus much more on conflicts, be it Kashmir, be it Palestine, be it... I mean, you, as you said, take a pick, there's always a foreign...
There's always something.
There's always something, and they seem always focused abroad. And never ever focused on anything here that cultivates an identity that is not rooted in the local, in the somewhere, but constantly is out there anywhere.
So that's very interesting. Now, so that explains why you and a relatively small number of people who got directly into Hizb ut-Tahrir or whatever, but quite a few people who I guess were sort of much more gently on that journey in the sense of feeling alienated. You then came out of it quite emphatically and became, if you like, the other way. You started teaching ways out of radicalization, advising the government on how to prevent people falling in with a bad crowd. What was your way out? Was there a moment when you said, "I've made a terrible mistake"?
Yes. Yeah. It was my parents, my family. The fact that my father was very godly, my mother was regularly praying, and I wasn't. And I quickly noticed the hypocrisy between wanting to impose God's government on the whole world through a caliphate, but not being physically and spiritually close to God in a way that my parents were. And they'd be up in the Fajr prayer, which is about 5 o'clock in the morning, and I'd be sleeping through because I'd been busy leafleting local mosques and campaigning for, Somalia and Bosnia and whatnot. So that was a key moment. But I think the second key moment was seeing Daniel, the last and the end result of that kind of hatred that then in us, the Muslim-based supremacist identity, seeing a student on my campus being killed because of the calls to a global identity, because of seeing others as inferior based on religious identity, and because of the call to jihad, which we thought was just something that would happen over there somewhere, but when it starts to happen in your own country, in your own college campus, you start to worry. And I think the last thing was, I was beginning to grow up, and you realise there's kind of utopian, high-level solutions don't really matter.
Yeah, extremism is always a young man's game. And it's very striking, actually, if you look at the general profile of the kinds of Western-born Muslims who went to Iraq or Syria in the militias. They were very similar to the profile of any other terrorist group down the ages, the Baden-Meinhof gangs, the IRA. So, but what I think is very interesting about this is that for you, religion was a way out. And I think a lot of people watching might find that a little bit surprising. So I'd like to just dwell on this. So you've written very eloquently. You wrote a great, not the book we're going to come on to, but your last book, House of Islam, which was, as I read it anyway, was really kind of homage to Sufism and an exploration of global Islam told through the lives of saints and scholars on different continents. And you've just told us that the Sufi tradition that you had at home was, internal, quietist, spiritual. It was not about the, imposition of outward forms. I think that may surprise quite a few people, that actually the people attracted to political Islam, and particularly that minority of those who are attracted to political Islam who go the whole hog and become violent or join militias, that they're not in any conventional sense pious, that their actual religious observation is quite wanting.
Yes, I was shocked by that, because I had medical doctors and engineers in my college years asking me to read out sermons in Arabic for them so they could master it before they go and deliver the sermon on a Friday. And I was taught Arabic growing up at home, but they hadn't been. So they had no grasp of religion. I think it was the great Rabbi Lord Sachs used to say that good religion is the answer to bad religion. And I think he's absolutely right that once you understand that, we use the word religion, but basically it's faith. It's a relationship with God, and it has a spiritual presence. Politicians had it throughout, whether it's Disraeli, whether it's Gladstone, indeed Edmund Burke. they had that inner core, but the secret is not to impose it or to make it dogmatic and evangelical. And once you have that inner power, you know, Abraham Lincoln, you know, you're able to do great things on the quiet. But the moment you make it into a demagogic force, that it becomes a danger.
So let's just stick though with, because you worked in deradicalisation, for want of a better shorthand, for a bit, and I suspect some of the criticism you're now getting stems from that time and some of the other people involved. But it's a rather counterintuitive idea, I think, to a lot of people, that the answer to radicalization may in fact be religion, may in fact be reading the texts and entering into a more spiritual paradigm. I remember being very struck by one news story. There were two lads from Birmingham, British Pakistani boys, who were picked up on their way to the airport. They were on their way to Syria to join, I don't think it was the Islamist State, it was one of the other hardline jihadi groups. And the last thing that they bought from Amazon, presumably to read on the plane, they bought these two books which were Islam for Dummies and the Quran for Dummies. And I think it's quite an interesting idea that at least in your case, and I think in some others, I've heard people in the security services say this, that actually a more, if you like, traditional understanding of religion is the answer to...
Yes, yes. And we see that again and again and again and again, Daniel, whether it's the Saudis using a much more pietistic, contextualized approach to scripture. I mean, you talked about the House of Islam, but what's really moving for me is that when you realize that British law and Islamic law are not at odds with one another, that there isn't an inherent clash of civilizations, that secular law and Islamic law can be harmonized through what's called the maqasid al-sharia angle, then you realize that Islam is in fact fully part of Western civilization, and Muslim communities should be entirely at home in Western civilization, because we are not, I mean, this is not, let's say, China,
right,
where...
Britain is a Quran-compliant society because you're free to be a Muslim here in a way that you're not in China.
I couldn't put it better myself.
But let's just dwell for a moment on this maqasid, the higher aims, I think is how you interpret it. So, I mean, one of the examples you gave in House of Islam was facial hair. It's a trivial but easy and telling illustration. So the Prophet enjoined his followers to trim their moustaches, not their beards. Now, if you're interpreting that broadly and you're looking for what's the morality, what's the point he's making, you would say, well, he's telling people not to be dandies. He's telling people not to be vain, not to spend all day in front of the mirror, right? And that would be the normal way, and for centuries, the way in which Islamic jurisprudence would have interpreted it. But among this particular Salafist interpretation, everything is literal. So hence the people that we see literally shaving their moustaches but growing their beards. Now, that's, if you like, a minor example, but you could make the same point about you don't literally need to amputate people's hands, but you do need to get the concept of respect for property.
Exactly right. And that's exactly right. And that's called the maqasid al-sharia, as you identified. And it's the same approach on all of the capital punishments or the hudud punishments, that think about the reason behind the law. So, you know, the reason why fornication and adultery are forbidden is to uphold the family unit. The reason why theft is forbidden is to uphold property laws.
Yeah.
And you talk quite often about the way that the Prophet Muhammad very early on called for low taxation and owning of property. And I got that from you, by the way.
Yeah, he was 1,000 years before Adam Smith, yeah.
Your focus, and you've done that in public over and over again. And I think it's understanding that spirit, that Islam was founded by a businessman prophet who, when he went to Medina from Mecca, refused charity for the house of worship that he created, the masjid or the mosque. He insisted on paying for it. And as you keep reminding us, Daniel, that when the floods and famines hit Medina, he refused to lower or increase the taxes.
Well, he did. I mean, I love this because it's permanently relevant. A lot of people intuitively think that objects have an intrinsic price, just as they have an intrinsic volume or an intrinsic weight, and that selling for an excessive price is profiteering and is, in many societies down the centuries, has been treated as a criminal offence. It certainly has been something that people disapprove of. And yet, of course, the Prophet, being a businessman, understood that price by definition is what people are prepared to pay, you know, and this was not something that was a widespread understanding anywhere in the world at that time, in Europe or in the Islamic world. And of course, the episode you mentioned, famine in Medina, people say lower prices. He says provision is in the hands of God, right? Because he knows, because he's a trader, what happens if you artificially lower prices. You get an immediate glut, and then you get a shortage. Now, I wish I could say that we've all caught up to that point,